We continue reading the case of Fiona Alfred versus Mario Alfred. This divorce case heard between 2019 and 2020. Submissions for the claimant that's Mrs. Alfred. She filed for divorce. Now, Mrs. DeMarco Franklin, attorney at law for Mrs. Alfred, stated that the areas of dispute were: A. Whether the property is the matrimonial home. B. Whether Mrs. Alfred is entitled to a 50% interest in the property, or whether any factors stated in Section 7 of the Property Rights of Spouses Act exist to displace the equal share rule. So the 50% is the equal share rule, and there are factors that can displace it. Alright? So it's important that you know about those factors. C. Whether Mrs. Alfred abandoned her beneficial interest in the property. D. Whether Mrs. Alfred is entitled to occupational rent, and if the answer is affirmative, if it is yes, in what amount. No evidence was led, nor was the issue of occupational rent pursued in the latter written and oral submissions. So I considered that this remedy was abandoned for all intents and purposes. Alright, so occupational rent, they didn't even mention that. So these are the submissions by Mrs. Alfred's lawyer. Counsel highlighted several aspects of the evidence to show that the house was purchased and occupied as the family home. The court was also asked to consider the course of conduct of the parties when they acquired the property. Right. So the course of conduct, what they agreed to, who paid, what money, how much, those are important. Make your records of these things. The claimant moved to a rented, that's Mrs. Alfred, moved to a rented property with the children, and later Mr. Alfred resided with them on the weekends rather than returning to the house that they had owned with his mother in St. Catherine. The parties bought the property together and made substantial improvements before moving in as a family. The entire family resided there, and although the defendant, that's Mr. Alfred, had said he purchased the property as an investment, he did agree that as a husband, he was making a home for his family. So, Mr. Alfred said he purchased the home as an investment. But it seems as if Mrs. Alfred's lawyers were pressing him and say, as a husband, didn't you buy this house for your family? And at some point, he said yes. It seems like that's what happened here. Mrs. Franklin argued that based on its usage, the property was indeed the family home, and therefore Mrs. Alfred is entitled by law to a 50% share of the legal and beneficial interest. She pointed out that no Section 17 factor existed to cause the court to vary the equal share rule. So that's Mrs. Franklin said it. So Mrs. Franklin is Mrs. Alfred's lawyer. All right, where were we? Counsel asked the court, as a lawyer, asked the court to find that Mrs. Alfred did not discontinue possession, nor was she dispossessed. Counsel argued that at all times the couple acted together as a unit for the benefit of the family. She submitted that the parties agreed that Mr. Alfred would take care of the family's financial obligations in Jamaica. At the same time, Mrs. Alfred would deal with the cost of living and finances to care for the family in the USA, while also making provisions for his resident status application. This led to the eventual reunification of the family in the USA. So here Mr. Alfred was saying that Mrs. Alfred should not get any part of the house because she did not contribute financially. But then Mrs. Alfred's lawyer is saying that Mr. Alfred and Mrs. Alfred agreed that he would spend money on the house in Jamaica while she would spend money on the house overseas. So the fact that she was not spending money to maintain the house in Jamaica should not be considered as an evidence that she abandoned the house. All right. Mrs. Franklin urged the court to reject Mr. Franklin's evidence and that of his mother, that Mrs. Franklin had never visited the house after she left in 2007. So you see here, in a divorce case, which in this case is a bitter, heated battle. The family of the spouses are drawn in it. Mr. Franklin's mother is drawn directly into it. And I'm sure other family members are just watching and are there distressed over the situation. No. She, however, conceded that although both parties live in the same house, they live separate lives from May 2017, as indicated by Mr. Alfred. With respect to Mr. Alfred's claim of adverse possession, Mrs. Franklin submitted that to prove a claim in adverse possession, the defendant is required to establish open, undisturbed, and exclusive possession of the property to the exclusion of Mrs. Alfred. I just paused a while ago and looked up adverse possession. This is, I found a definition from Cornell Law School. It says, adverse possession is a doctrine under which a person in possession of land owned by someone else may acquire valid title to it, so long as certain requirements are met, and the adverse possessor is in possession for a sufficient period of time, as defined by a statute of limitation. The common law requirements have evolved over time and they vary between jurisdictions. Typically, for an adverse possessor to obtain title, their possession of the property must be continuous, and so on and so forth. Alright, so here, that's what it means. Claim of adverse possession. That means he was in possession of it for so long that he was entitled to be the only person who owned it. All right. She argued that Mrs. Alfred's lawyer argued that the evidence was pointing in the opposite direction, as Mr. Alfred would be in a subsisting marriage while acting in secrecy. In other words, Mr. Alfred's claim of adverse possession meant that Mrs. Alfred would be scheming to deprive Mr. Alfred of her interest. That Mr. Alfred would be scheming to deprive Mrs. Alfred of her interest in the property while they were still married, living together and acting as a unit, and even having amicable communication about important issues relevant to the property. So she's saying that Mr. Alfred's claim to adverse possession shows that he's coming up with some kind of scheme to deprive Mrs. Alfred of her share in the property. Counsel relied on Carl Stewart versus Lauriston Stewart. These are some other cases, some other Supreme cases. So they looked at these cases, saw what the decision was and how they would apply to this particular case. I'm going to look at submissions for Mr. Alfred in our next video.